Welcome to another episode of The Identity Navigator, the podcast where we unpack identity security, governance, and architecture across the enterprise stack. I'm your host, Rohit. Today, we are diving into the fascinating evolution of identity governance and administration, or IGA tools. From the monolithic provisioning engines of CA and Oracle to the cloud native IGA frameworks powering SailPoint and Saviynt, and the merger and acquisitions fueled strategies of Okta, CyberArk, and a growing pool of startups. We will examine how IGA has evolved, where it's going, and what it means for modern identity ecosystems. So let's start from before IGA had a name. Let's rewind the clock back to the late 90s and early 2000s. This was an era when most companies didn't even know what identity governance meant. There were no shiny dashboards or policy engines. What we did have were a handful of IT admins and a whole lot of spreadsheets. Active Directory was the undisputed king of the enterprise. It handled authentication, group membership, and sometimes, if you were lucky, very crude access controls. But was AD an IGA system? Not, not really. It was more like the phone book of your IT world. It knew who you were, maybe even where you sat, but it had no clue why you had access to a sensitive database or if you still needed access to it. AD was typically owned by the Windows or infrastructure team, not security, not compliance, and definitely not business stakeholders, which meant that managing identity wasn't really anyone's job until something broke. So, how did we handle user lifecycle events back then? Usually through custom scripts written in VB script, Perl, or later PowerShell. These scripts did the basics of creating a user, adding the right AD group, and maybe emailing the help desk. But everything was brittle. If HR forgot to send a ticket, no user was created. If an employee left and no one removed their account, well, that account just sat there active forever. Compliance nightmare. Some companies took it a step further. They built homegrown provisioning systems. Think of a web form probably running on an internal IIS server where a manager could request access. That form would write to a database, and a nightly batch job would read from that database and trigger a script. Classic architecture was front end was an internal web portal, usually ASP.NET or a JSP. Databases were relational databases, typically SQL Server or Oracle. The logic layer were batch jobs and scripts, and the backend was Active Directory or direct application calls. It sounds simple, but the devil was in the details because these systems had no workflows. Approvals were either hard coded or manual. Most importantly, they had no audit trail unless someone thought to log to a file. And there was no revocation logic. Once granted, access was often forever. And no visibility for auditors. Everyone or everything lived in someone else's head or a script written 6 years ago by an engineer who had since left. But here is the kicker, because some of these systems are still around today, especially in industries like manufacturing and sometimes healthcare. I have walked into clients in 2025 still provisioning Oracle roles using homegrown Java apps built in 2009. Now, were these systems all bad? I wouldn't say so. They were fast, they were tailored to the business, and they worked until they didn't. But as organization grew, so did the cracks. Mergers, regulatory pressures, and cloud adoption started to expose just how fragile these setups really were. Now let's add some spice to this era of custom scripts and duct taped identity flows. Enter regulatory compliance, the single biggest friend to any IGA system. So let's set the scene a little bit more clearly. We are in early 2000s, and while most identity operations are held together by scripts and human memory, the regulators were waking up, thankfully, and they were not amused. First up, Sarbanes-Oxley, aka SOX. This was introduced in 2002 in publicly traded companies, finance, tech, manufacturing, basically all of Wall Street. Why? Because of scandals like Enron and WorldCom that cooked the books and fooled investors. SOX was Congress saying, enough. We need controls, we need accountability. And thank you for that. And that trickled down into IT. For identity, SOX basically said you have controls over who can access financial systems, proof of approvals, and audit trails that show you didn't fudge access before a quarter end close. That meant CFOs started asking CIOs, can you prove that only the right people have access to SAP or Oracle financials? And suddenly, those custom scripts, yeah, they weren't cutting it. And then there was HIPAA, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This was introduced a little bit before SOX. So SOX was 2002, HIPAA was 1996, which enforced more. It was enforced more strictly in early 2000s rather than when it came out. HIPAA, as the name suggests, was in healthcare, so hospitals and insurance providers. And this was to protect patient privacy in an increasingly digital medical world. So for identity teams, HIPAA meant you must ensure only authorized personnel can view or update electronic health records. You must audit who accessed what and when, and you need to prove that access was appropriate. Problem was, hospital IT often ran legacy electronic medical record systems, which are normally called EMR systems, with zero integration. Nurses shared logins, terminated employees still had access. Audit logs, if they existed, were in some proprietary database that nobody dared to query. And HIPAA asked, who saw this patient's chart? The IT team replied, well, we think it was Bob. He said he logged in. And then there was GLBA, the Graham Leach Bliley Act. And I feel like I'm teaching a CISSP class, but stick with me here because these all make sense, right? So GLBA, the Graham Leach Bliley Act, was introduced in 1999, and this was mostly for financial institutions, so your banks, mortgage lenders, and credit unions. And this was to force banks to protect customer data and communicate how it is shared. So for identity governance, GLBA meant strong access control to financial customer data, employee training and monitoring, and prove that access was limited to business needs. So a lot of things that we take for granted today, this was the time that these things were coming up and being defined. So if your bank's loan system was still being managed via shared folders on a Windows server, well, GLBA didn't love that. Each of these regulations came with their own flavor, but they all demanded the same three things. And these are the same three things you still need to have very clear answers for, and sometimes most companies don't. Know who has access, know why they have it, and be able to prove it to an auditor. Now, don't you think all of these questions are the ones that the identity threat detection and response tools are trying to answer in 2005 or 2025 today? And back then, even back then, most companies couldn't answer these questions because identity governance at that time wasn't a system. It was an assumption. It was like, well, we trust Bob. He has been here 10 years. And this trust me bro model sometimes still exists today. But that might have worked in 1999. But post Enron, post HIPAA, post credit crisis, trust wasn't good enough anymore. You needed evidence. There weren't just technical problems anymore. These were legacy problems or these were legal problems, and you had to prove that only the right people had access. Access was approved by someone accountable. You could revoke that access was needed, and you had to document all of it, right? So now these were legal requirements, so you have to comply to these things. So how did the organizations respond in light of all these regulations? Honestly, like companies respond today for any new regulations that comes out. A lot of folks scrambles. Some threw more people at the problem. Other created access review committees that printed out spreadsheets, walked over to managers and got handwritten approvals. And I'm not joking. So you would see these massive Excel files with 300 rows of users' name, and managers was expected to verify line by line whether Jane from finance still needed access to the AP module. Spoiler alert, most managers just checked all good and moved on. Some companies tried to bake compliance into their homegrown tools, adding basic approval workflows, maybe a two-step form or a checkbox saying manager approved. But most of it was theater. The intent was there, but the execution, let's just say an external auditor would not be impressed. In many cases, IT played defense. Security teams were like, well, we provisioned the access and we removed it if someone told us to. So that's governance, right? Meanwhile, audit teams wanted time stamped approval records, periodic access reviews, and evidence of SOD enforcement. And most companies couldn't provide any of that without someone digging through email archives or log files. That is when the term identity governance start to take shape, not as a technical function, but as a business need tied to compliance. The real problem was that identity decisions were buried in operational chaos. So when SOX or HIPAA showed up and asked who approved these users access to financial data, all you had was a shrug, a shared mailbox, or if you were lucky, a .pst file from 5 years ago. That growing gap between what regulators expected and what internal tools could prove, and that pressure, that sudden need to turn identity decisions into defensible processes, is what opened the door for the first wave of IGA products. Governance has finally outgrown scripts and spreadsheets. That's when the first wave of true IGA vendors entered the scene, trying to bring structure, governance, and controls to what has been, and until then, a patchwork of well meaning duct tape. So let's now look into the first movers, these legacy giants that so many of us would have heard of. Let's talk about the OGs, the first generation IGA vendors. These tools were monolithic, on prem, and required heavy customization. Think multi year implementations and expensive professional services. Governance was often an afterthought, and the focus was provisioning, not policy. So, why did the companies choose them? Well, it was simple. They were the only game in town. They could handle scale and they checked the boxes for auditors and regulators. But over time, they became victims of their own complexity. Organizations realized that running an IGA program shouldn't feel like managing an SAP rollout. The appetite for faster, cloud friendly, API driven tools grew, and these legacy giants started to look more like anchors than engines. But we are getting ahead of ourselves here. So, by the mid 2000s, identity governance was finally getting attention, and most importantly, the budget. The regulators were circling, the auditors were asking tough questions, and the days of managing access with scripts, spreadsheets, and Slack messages, well, Lotus Notes messages back then, were clearly numbered. And right then, boom, the legacy IGA giants moved in. So let's talk about the five that truly shaped the first generation of enterprise identity governance. They were Sun Identity Manager or SIM, Oracle Identity Manager or OIM. There was CA Identity Manager. There was IBM Tivoli Identity Manager, TIM or ISIM, and Novell Identity Manager, NAM or IDM. So Sun Identity Managers was the customizer's paradise. Originally known as the WaveSet Lighthouse, SIM was born out of Austin, Texas, and was acquired by Sun Microsystems in 2003. It was the identity system of choice for those who wanted ultimate flexibility, a toolkit more than a finished product. The secret sauce, a powerful but arcane XML and XLT based workflow engine that let you build almost anything. But the catch was you had to know how. So this was favored by higher ed or tech forward enterprises or global telcos. It was wildly customizable and there was a strong community of tinkerers. But it was also hard to maintain and tribal knowledge was everything. So mostly in-house teams and boutique consultancies were brought in to implement it. But when Oracle acquired Sun Microsystem in 2010, many thought SIM would become Oracle's main IGA product, right? But here is the twist. Oracle already had its own identity tool by then. So now Oracle had OIM and Oracle had this acquisition. So there was a lot of confusion in the market around this time. So Waveset Technologies, which was like the product name was Lighthouse. This was introduced in 2001, acquired by Sun in 2003. This was renamed as Sun Identity Manager, and then this was finally acquired by Oracle via Sun's acquisition in 2010, and the support ended in 2017. But I loved SIM, and I loved SIM because of the fact that this was one of the earliest identity provisioning system to offer policy-based workflows via XML or XSLT. So, for those of you who are familiar with that hibernate-based SailPoint approach and how easy it is to configure things in XML, I just love doing that in Waveset. So I really loved Sun Identity Manager for quite some time. And then there was another OG, Oracle Identity Manager, and this was the structured strategist. OIM wasn't born at Oracle. It came from a company called Thor Technologies, acquired by Oracle in 2005. And unlike SIM's build your own model, OIM offered a structured enterprise scale governance framework out of the box. So this was favored by banks and most of the Fortune 500s and enterprises that already bet on Oracle stack, which were many. Uh, Built-in SOX compliant workflows and a scalable RBAC model really worked for OIM. But the deployment was complex and there were performance issues if the tool was misconfigured. So for the implementations, you brought in either Oracle Consulting or large system integrators like the Infosys and Deloitte of the world. But important to remember is that while SIM and OIM coexisted under Oracle, they were never merged. SIM, which was also known as Waveset, was eventually sunset, and Oracle encouraged customers to migrate to OIM, which was of- often a very painful transition. So Oracle's origin or OIM's origin was Thor Technologies. This was introduced in 2002, acquired by Oracle in 2005, and it still exists as part of Oracle Identity Governance Suite through though it is increasingly seen as legacies. But many big companies today, I would assume in Fortune 500, do still use OIM today. And I know of many manufacturing companies that still use it because they have no need to move to a newer tool. Uh, but fun fact is, Oracle was pitched as a more scalable and structured alternative to SIM. Now, there is another OG, and this has given me many heartburns, but also paid my bills for many years. This was the CA Identity Manager. And if I have to call it something, I will call it the enterprise tank, because CA's entry came via acquisition too, including Nettegrity, known for SiteMinder. Their IGA suite became the choice for large enterprises that wanted governance done by the book. So it was really favored by financial services, the government, and utility companies. It had a strong policy framework, and it had a really huge connector library. But at the same time, it had a little bit of a clunky UI, rigid architecture, and uh, integrators dependencies. So the TCSs and Wipros and Accentures and CA owns team were largely brought in to implement these tools. But a good thing about CA was that CA was compliance forward before it was cool, but suffered when customers wanted agility over audit logs. So the CA's origin actually was from something called as eTrust Admin, which was developed by Computer Associates or CA. Right? The first version was released in 2003, and this actually evolved from earlier CA tools. And over 2000s, it was rebranded and expanded, multiple times, and finally got acquired in 2004. It was ultimately acquired by Broadcom in 2018 as part of the bigger CA technology acquisition. And I love the compliance first approach of this tool, and that is why, in very regulated industries, it was a clear favorite. And then there was the IBM Tivoli Identity Manager, TIM or ISIM, and it was a systems engineer's dream or nightmare, depending on your own personal perspective. But I'll continue to call it the system engineer's dream, because this was big iron identity. If you were running ZOS or DB2, WebSphere, and had thousands of employees across countries and business units, Tivoli was the grown-up option. This was really favored by public sector, healthcare systems, and infrastructure giants. And it truly scaled like a tank, strong on audit and reporting. But the upgrades were painful and very resource heavy. So IBM Global Services was mostly brought in to implement this, or in-house enterprise IT could also do it. But Tivoli felt less like a product and more like a platform that needed a dedicated team just to babysit it. But for organizations that needed deep policy controls across very old systems, it got the job done. So it was introduced in 2002 as IBM Tivoli's Identity Manager 4.4, and later it was rebranded as IBM Security Identity Manager. Right? Thus the name TIM or ISIM are used interchangeably. And then it merged into IBM Security Identity Governance and Intelligence IGI platform later, and it was known for massive deployments in governments and infrastructure heavy orgs. And then there was Novell Identity Manager, and if I have to call it something, I'll call it the silent operator. Often overlooked, Novell quietly ran identity for thousands of schools, hospitals, and state government. It came bundled with eDirectory and had a strong event driven architecture that was ahead of its time. It was really, as I mentioned, it was really favored by education and healthcare and state and local government. Its real-time provisioning engine uh, had low latencies and agent-based models, so it was pretty cool at that time. But it fell behind on cloud, and it wasn't well marketed, and the product suite itself was a little confusing. It took me years to really understand what their product suite was. Was it NIM? Was it NAM? It was IDM. So the marketing, I think, struggled with Novell a little bit. Internal sysadmin could easily implement it, but there were also Novell partners and education-centric system integrators. So, but Novell IDM, I think, my biggest think the biggest thing that I liked about it was very developer friendly, but it stayed niche. When Novell faded in 2010s and it was eventually acquired by Micro Focus, the identity product went with it. So it was evolved from dir XML or dir XML in 2003, right? It was originally launched around 2000s, the Novell Identity Manager, and then it was ultimately acquired by Micro Focus, I think as of 2020. But really cool thing about it was its event driven model made real time provisioning possible way before it was common elsewhere. I know of many companies who still struggle with uh, event driven model, especially around provisioning, and Noel did it very well. I just hope that it was marketed a little better and it didn't fall behind on cloud, because this is one of the OGs that had a ton of potential but never really up to it. Oracle had its days and CA had its days under the sun. IBM, was very successful. Novell was pretty successful. It could have been more successful just by a little bit of tweaks. But overall, why did these products dominated? Because each of these giants had just enough vision, power, and ecosystem to dominate their niche. SIM for those who wanted full control, OIM for companies betting on Oracle, CA for audit driven logs, IBM for scale and system integration, and Novell for fast reactive identity in education and healthcare. But in the end, they all suffered from the same issues. They were too heavy, they were too slow, they were too tied to on prem thinking, and they were too expensive to maintain and upgrade. So their reign lasted roughly 2003 to 2015, which is the era that we are going to call as an OG era in IGA, with many organizations still limping along on those systems, even today frozen in time, because migrating of them is a non trivial activity. Then from this, we move over to the rise of governance from birth certificates to border control. Provisioning a user is like issuing a birth certificate. Governance is more like immigration control. Who is coming in, what they can access, how long they can stay, and who is watching. In the 2010s, we witnessed a massive shift. The earlier wave of IGA tools like SIM, OIM, CA, Tivoli, Novell were engineered for provisioning. That is, they were fantastic at creating accounts across a fleet of directories and systems, but they were never really designed to ask the hard questions. Should this user have that access? Is this level of privilege risky? Can we prove we revoked it when they left? And this is where modern identity governance first platform stepped in. And let's look at some of the key players in this space or this era. Obviously, undoubtedly, I will have to talk about SailPoint Identity IQ here, or IIQ. So SailPoint's architecture was built on simple but powerful idea: bring the identity data to the center. This was the core powerful idea that they have. And unlike legacy systems that scattered logic across scripts and connectors, SailPoint Identity IQ aggregated identity data into a centralized model called the identity cube. Think of it like a digital twin of every user, capturing not just who they are, but what they can access, what roles they hold, and what risks they pose. It introduced a policy driven engine with a rule based provisioning, access certifications, and role mining, and it was all visual and auditable and extensible. And later, with Identity Now or their Identity Security Cloud Now, SailPoint was successfully able to pivot to cloud native, offering microservices, REST APIs, and event driven workflows, making governance scalable and much easier to integrate with modern ecosystems. So, SailPoint originally was launched in 2006, and it was purpose built for compliance and attestations. And you know, the breakout moment was that after SOX, enterprise realized that they needed visibility into who had what, and SailPoint made that central. And the How it differentiated from OGs were that instead of workflows first like OIM, SailPoint was data first. Aggregated access data from across the org, visualized it, and let managers certify it. It was lightweight as compared to some of the OGs, really helped it as well. It was just cleaner, right? So the banks, the healthcare orgs, the Fortune 500s, and especially those already frustrated with the complexities of legacy tools, really started adopting SailPoint. SailPoint is still a leader in Gartner's MQ, and now it is evolved or evolving into the SaaS native SailPoint identity security cloud. And they have been really expanding into this AI powered identity security. SailPoint IPO'd in 2017 and it was acquired by Thomas Bravo in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. And uh, this SailPoint will always have this legacy of this governance first thinking, introducing concepts like identity cubes and access reviews and role mining at scale. These concepts existed, but SailPoint really brought them to the forefront of how to do them at scale. And SailPoint is like a high-end architect's Lego set, detailed, structured, and designed for those who want to model governance with precision. You get everything you need to build the identity universe, identity cubes, policies, role hierarchies, certifications, all meticulously organized. It is not a free for all kit, it's structured for control, and once it is in place, it is beautiful to manage. Enterprises love it because it brings order to the chaos, especially when auditors come knocking. We cannot go ahead without talking about Saviynt now, because Saviynt flipped the script by asking, what if governance was built cloud first? Right? So far, what we have done is legacy unable to migrate to cloud, legacy pivoting successfully to cloud, but Savient started asking, let's build governance cloud first, not just ported to the cloud. Because from day one, Savient's architecture embraced multi-tenant, SaaS, microservices, and API first design. And that made it, these architecture choices really made it naturally elastic, always updated, and easy to plug into cloud apps like Salesforce, Workdays, AWS, and GCP without clunky connectors or agents. And at its core, Savient runs on a unified identity platform, blending IGA, application GRC, and privileged access into a single pane of glass. And instead of juggling multiple tools, organizations get risk aware identity management that could scale with their hybrid and cloud workloads. Governance decisions become contextual, driven by usage analytics and access behaviors and policy violations, and not just static rules. And because it is cloud native, Savient can do what legacy tools struggled with. Things like automated segregation of duties checks in SAP or real-time governance of ephemeral cloud entitlements in AWS. So Savient was founded in 2011 and its USP has always been this cloud-first governance approach. So while SailPoint began on-prem and moved to cloud, SailPoint started with GRC as their DNA and aimed to unify identity, app GRC, and privileged access. So Saviynt continues to be a strong player, or one of the strongest player alongside SailPoint in the cloud-first vertical. It's known for its extensibility and coverage of cloud native resources. And it competes very closely with SailPoint today in identity governance, but also with CyberArk in privileged identity governance, because they have recently introduced their ISPM offering at an RSA conference. And uh, for me, the legacy that Savient will leave behind is this unifying identity governance with risk context across apps and clouds. So Savient feels like a next generation Lego set. Not only can you build things, but the bricks also have smart sensors that detect risk, context, and behaviors in real time. As you build your governance structure, it's already analyzing, should this user have this AWS role? Is this access out of policy? It's the fusion of identity Lego and compliance AI, and it fits perfectly into a cloud native world. Then we have one identity, which is by the Quest, right? So one identity took a little bit of a different path. They didn't try to do or be everything at once. Instead, they built a modular identity architecture that let organizations pick what they needed: governance, provisioning, privileged access, or AD management, and plug it in without ripping out their entire IAM foundation. At its heart, at its heart, one identity is about practicality and integration. Many companies already had Active Directory, maybe even some legacy IAM tooling. And one identity said, let's work with what you have got. Their identity manager product offered robust lifecycle and governance feature, but it was tightly integrated with their active roles for AD and Azure AD or Enter ID and safeguard for privileged access. Architecturally, one identity, they really leaned on workflow templates, customizable data models, and REST APIs with hybrid deployment options on prem, cloud, or both. That made it a favorite among mid sized enterprises and those in heavy Microsoft centric environments. One identity might not have all the bells and whistles of SailPoint or Saviynt, but it has earned a loyal following by making IAM less painful to deploy and more predictable to maintain. Think of one identity like a box of Lego bricks or Lego blocks for IAM. You don't have to build the entire spaceship on day one. You start with what you need, maybe just AD delegation or privileged access. Then, as your identity program matures, you snap on governance, add workflows, plug into cloud apps, all without tearing down what's already there. And that modularity is one identity's superpower. It doesn't force you into an all or nothing deployment like some legacy suites did. Instead, it says, let's solve your most pressing identity pain today and build towards the rest one brick at a time. So even though the Quest software was active in identity tooling since early 2000s, one identity as a formal suite became prominent in mid 2010s. And its modular approach and customer could adopt just governance or provisioning or privileged access separately really stood out. And this is really good for mid-sized enterprises who wanted governance without the overhead of SailPoint or OIM. So currently they are focused on unified identity platform. Uh, they acquired a company called as Belabit for session monitoring, and they also have a privileged identity management or a PIM angle right now. And they are very well suited for orgs that want hybrid governance without complexity. And their core legacy will always be making IGA more modular and digestible for mid-market organizations. Let's talk about Microsoft. Microsoft Enter ID governance, which was formerly Azure AD identity governance. Microsoft, as Microsoft does, didn't enter the identity governance game the traditional way. They quietly embedded it into the ecosystem. Millions of companies were already using these Microsoft 365, Azure, Teams, SharePoint, and more. And instead of asking customers to adopt a whole new IGA platform, they said, we are already managing your identities. Let's govern them too. Pretty smart, right? So Entra ID governance started showing up in pieces: access reviews and entitlement management, lifecycle workflows, and privileged identity management, all tightly woven into Azure AD, Entra ID. And suddenly organizations has built-in tools to manage joiner, mover, lever processes, enforce just-in-time access, and ensure only the right people had persistent access to the right resources. Its architecture is cloud native, API driven, and deeply integrated into Microsoft Graph, making it incredibly easy to automate governance tasks across the Microsoft stack. No separate infrastructure, no agents, and no third party complexity. That's why Microsoft Entra resonates with small to mid-sized org and even large enterprises who are all in on Microsoft, because it feels like identity governance is just already there and it is seamless and not bolted on, right? So pieces of it continue to roll out between 2017 and 2021, and major pieces still getting rolled out today, but major pieces between 2017 and 2021. And the native integrations with Microsoft ecosystem, everything from your Office 365 to Intune to Teams, is definitely a USP for this. And the key differentiator is about its approach for governance for the masses, which is baked into Microsoft licensing, accessible and API rich. And as any org using Microsoft 365, especially SMBs who don't want a separate IGA vendor, it's a good choice. And they're building out and maturing their features for access reviews and entitlement management and PIM, privileged identity management and lifecycle workflows. So they're continuing to mature these offerings, or bring in newer features here. But it currently lacks full cross-system governance depth of SailPoints or Savients, but it is definitely improving. And the core legacy would be the democratization of the governance for Microsoft-centric organizations. So if one identity is a Lego block, SailPoint is the architect's kit. The Saviynt is the smart set with sensors, and Microsoft Entra is the Lego base plate. It's the foundation more orgs already have in place, and it is built to connect and stabilize everything else. You may not be able to build the most complex IGA castle on it, but for organizations living in the Microsoft world, Entra gives you a solid, reliable base with native tools for governance, access reviews, and lifecycle flows that just work. Great. Uh, so let's compare these uh, legacy tools with governance first tools, or the SailPoint Saviynt versus the OIMs of the world, because originally the OGs were focused on account provisioning, and then it has shifted to the governance first model about access, visibility, risk, and attestation. The focus has definitely shifted from on-prem heavy to cloud first or hybrid. User experience has changed from admin driven batch style to manager and audit friendly UI. Excuse me. The risk and compliance component felt bolted on the legacy tools, and now it feels like native to the product. Data aggregation was initially minimal and now is core to the product design. And now, initially, the legacy tools were very workflow centric, and now the newer tools are more policy and analytics centric. So, these are the major shifts in how the product roadmap or the products have evolved. So, who preferred what? Large banks or federal agencies who were tired of upgrading OIM or CA, they migrated to initially SailPoint Identity IQ. Cloud native orgs or digital transformations in motions adopted Saviynt. Microsoft heavy or mid-sized companies often lean towards Entra ID governance or one identity. And for companies still running mainframes and web spheres, they stuck with IBM IGI or some of the legacy tools. So where are they now in 2025? SailPoint, as you all know, or as you might know, is pushing this AI governance identity security cloud and refining their SaaS platform as we speak. Saviynt is rapidly expanding both its client base and product offering. It is also expanding in geographical markets like Europe and more regulated verticals, and it is focusing on things beyond IGA as well. One Identity is targeting mid-market with integrated identity platform, and Microsoft is growing fast, and especially as Microsoft 365 adoption spreads globally. So the market has shifted from just can Rohit get access to should Rohit have this access and for how long. Then there is this cloud disruptions that happened at the same time. So around 2015, the cloud wave hit real hard, and organizations moved to Workday, Salesforce, Azure AD, and AWS. And legacy IGA tools struggled because the connectors weren't ready, and the deployments took too long, and cloud native expectations didn't align with on-prem tool chains. That is when Saviynt repositioned itself as cloud-born, and SailPoint doubled down on APIs and identity intelligence. That is where identity now was conceptualized and born, which was SailPoint's SaaS IGA offering. And we also saw during the same time of the cloud disruption, the niche players like Okta and One Identity and Core Security were trying to offer lightweight governance, but they were more access management than full-blown IGA. Then fast forward to 2020 to 2024 is what I will call as the acquisition era. So SailPoint was acquired by Thoma Bravo, and Saviynt raised aggressive funding rounds and expanded into ITDR and enterprise apps. Okta made plays to integrate IGA features via workflows and lifecycle hooks, and CyberArk began acquiring capabilities to move beyond PAM into full lifecycle identity. And we also saw new entrants like Omada, which is an European player with strong compliance credentials, and SecZeta, which focused on non-human identities, and SecureEnds, which was betting big on audit readiness. And what is the trends that defines the future? Ah, I have to tell AI, right? So AI and identity intelligence, role mining, access recommendations, ITDR, ISPM, agentic AI, governance of agentic AI, both internally using AI for operational maturity of IAM systems, and securing or governing these agentic AIs is definitely one of the most talked about things today. Just in time access, we continue to talk about it, and this continues to evolve, especially as more and more workloads migrate to the cloud. Policy as code, right? IGA is being embedded into DevOps pipelines and APIs. The identity fabric, which is originally coined by Gartner, Gartner's idea of identity woven around cloud, SaaS, and on-prem. And then decentralized identity. I'm just calling it out in a trend right now, but I'm not too convinced myself because I keep hearing about it, but it never really lives up to its potential. But in terms of trends, I would call out AI and identity intelligence, JIT, policy as code, identity fabric, and then silently call out decentralized identity. So if you're choosing an IGA tool, here is what to ask. How quickly can we onboard apps? How flexible are access request workflows? Is it SaaS or just hosted legacy? How well does it support APIs, RBAC, and SOD? And can business users actually use this? We often think about project and program and whatnot, but for IGA, it's a very important distinction. IGA is not a product, it's a discipline, and tools are just the enablers. Remember how IGA has evolved. There wasn't a ask for a tool, there was asked to solve a problem coming from SOX and GLBA and HIPAA, right? So IGA is not a product, it's a discipline, and that's how you have to look at it. And that is why I'm asking you to ask these questions if you're evaluating your next IGA tool. But that wraps up our journey through the evolution of the IGA tools landscape. From on-prem dinosaurs to SaaS native dynamos, IGA has transformed in response to compliance, cloud, and complexity. The next few years will be about agility, intelligence, and integration. Thank you for listening and for taking this journey with me. You can always reach out to me via LinkedIn or send me an email at theidentitynavigator@gmail.com. Both of this info, I'll put it in the show notes. Until next time, this is Rohit, your identity navigator.